Okay, the next classification that we're going to look at is a pushrod engine, known as a cam in block. Right? It's known as an overhead valve engine because the valve is higher than the camshaft. All right, so that's your traditional V8. Toyota has overhead cam V8s, but all the Chevy and the Ford and the Chrysler and a whole lot of other engines have all been this design. This is considered old technology, yet we're still using it. The new Corvette still is a pushrod engine. It's been proven, and there's no rush to get rid of them. Right? Now compare that to overhead cam engines. Right? So if you look at this one, right? Single overhead cam. One cam that's working both banks, right? That's known as a SOC, single overhead cam. When you had a Ford Explorer that had a 4-liter single overhead cam engine, they were known as SOC engines. Right? If you order something, that's a terminology that will come in at the auto parts store. If you have 2 overhead camshafts, it's known as double overhead cam, right? 2 camshafts for the same bank. That's known as DOHC, dual overhead cam. So now if you have a single overhead cam V8, how many cams do you have? Right? You got 2. If you have a dual overhead cam V8, how many cams do you have? 4. Right, so now we go into bore, right? Bore is the size of the piston, the cylinder that the piston rides in. That, is the bore. If we go with a larger bore, you hear people honing out engines and boring them to larger sizes. The larger the bore, the greater area that the gases have to work. So the bigger the piston, the more power you can make. Right? So this is the bore. It's the diameter of the cylinder. And then the stroke is the distance that the piston travels up and down that cylinder. Right? So the stroke plays out where the longer this distance is, the greater amount of air and fuel can be drawn into the cylinder. The more air and fuel mixture inside the cylinder, the more force will result when that mixture is ignited. Okay, so when you hear them stroking an engine, it has to be something that allows that piston to travel further in the cylinder. Think about the components as you go further that can do that. Certain things are gonna result in no change of piston travel, where other things will. Usually crankshafts, right? You have crankshafts with different range. It can go up and it can go further. And you'll start seeing that kind of thing that goes in. So now engine displacement, the size of the engine is described as the volume displaced or swept by all the pistons. Okay, so you can have engines that are small that have the same rating as engines that are bigger, because it's not the outside, it's the cylinder area inside the engine that counts. Right? So the engine size is described as the displacement, the cubic inches or cubic centimeters of volume displaced or swept by all the pistons. A liter is equal to 1,000 cubic centimeters. Therefore, most engines today are identified by their displacement in liters. Right? So 1 liter equals 1,000 cc's, cubic centimeters. 1 liter equals 61 cubic inches of displacement. And 1 cubic inch equals 16.4 cc's. So you'll see any of these things play, or more than one thing describing an engine. So you can do some math and you can figure out what your engine would be calculated as, right? So to calculate displacement of an engine, use the formula for volume of a cylinder multiplied by the number of cylinders. Because the formula appears in different forms, it seems confusing, but it's pretty straightforward. It comes out the same, right? So the bore, it's a circle. So the bore times the stroke, the distance it travels, times this 0.7854, which is a constant, right? Don't put any thought to it. It's the way mathematical formulas work out. Times the number of cylinders. So if we had a 4-inch bore and a 3-inch stroke, 4 inches times 4 inches times 3 inches times 0.7854 times 6 cylinders gives us 226 cubic inches. Right? Because 1 cubic inch equals 16.4 cubic centimeters, the displacement equals 3,706 cubic centimeters, or rounded to 3,700, which would be 3.7 liters. And to convert cubic inches to liters, right, 61.02 cubic inches equals 1 liter. For example, 5 liters times 61.05 equals 305 cubic inches of displacement. 305 divided by 61.02 brings you to 5 liters of displacement. So every one of you can take your engine and change it from however it's calculated as and turn it into whatever, and then you can buy a label or a badge from a different car and stick it on your car and still be honest. So now we go into our compression ratio. And the compression ratio is the ratio of the volume of the cylinder when the piston is in the bottom of its stroke, as compared to the volume of the cylinder when the piston is at the top of the stroke. Right? So what that comes down to is how tightly we squeeze that mixture. And that's where we see 8-to-1 compression, 10-to-1 compression, 12-to-1 compression. Right? The more compression, the more performance is put into that particular engine. My little Mini is 11-to-1 compression. It's a tiny little thing. So it comes down to the tighter you squeeze it, the more force can be created when you ignite that power stroke. Okay, the reality of things is that you drive torque. You don't drive horsepower, right? Torque is the rotating force that may or may not result in motion, right? So if you're taking and you're pushing on a table and the table doesn't move, you're still applying torque even though the table didn't move, right? So this is measured in the amount of force that's multiplied by the length of the lever that's acting on it, right? So naturally, if you take a 1-foot wrench and you push down with 10 pounds of force, that is 1 pound-foot, okay? So when we're talking about a car, our crankshaft is turning. So we have a rotational motion that's being done. And the pushing down on it with the amount of force is going to dictate the torque. The metric unit for this torque is Newton meters, right? Newton is the metric unit for force, and meters is the distance. So 1 pound-feet is equivalent to 1.3558 Newton meters, right? It's just apples to apples this way. 1 Newton meter equals 0.7376 pound-foot. When they describe how strong a car runs, it's the torque value that the dyno measures. Then it's calculated. So you find a diesel, that diesel makes 1,000 pound-feet of force of torque at like 1,500 RPMs, right? The thing feels like it can pull a house down. You take another vehicle, and that might make 400 pound-feet at 6,000 RPMs, right? That calculation is going to lead to the horsepower, right? So what you do is you take the RPM times the torque divided by 5252, which is the constant, and that gives you your horsepower. So now that's what the dyno is doing. It's looking at the torque that RPM was at when it maxed out, and that it comes out the horsepower. So the horsepower is a calculation. Torque is what you actually feel.